In addition, Ruffles' extensive citations of the scholarly literature, his side-by-side comparisons of extracts from numerous A&E wisdom texts, his bibliographic notes on the parallels between Amenemope and Proverbs, and his index of Amenemope's Egyptian vocabulary were, and still are, extremely valuable contributions to the ongoing discussion. In the end, however, after marshalling one of the largest accumulations of evidence on Amenemope to date, Ruffle flatly rejected the Ehrman consensus, in much the same terms as Herzog had in 1929. It would seem that there is no ground for the commonly accepted idea that there has been direct copying from Amenemope by the compiler of Proverbs, or for the idea that there is any special connection between the two works at all. Both exhibit strong resemblances to other works of their native culture and of the ancient Near East generally. Some of the resemblances postulated between the two works are so superficial as to be almost entirely irrelevant, and the rest are no more significant than scores of others, which can be shown to exist generally between wisdom works from this area. The same features are present in most wisdom books, and to claim that this is evidence of copying is to ignore the strong influence of environment upon the formation of the customs and outlook of a people. But just as Herzog's position could not stand in the face of the evidence, neither can Ruffles, as we shall see shortly. Eri Grumach's 1972 doctoral dissertation 312 took a completely different approach. Grumach revived a notion which had first been proposed as far back as Lange, i.e., that the similarities between Amenemope and Proverbs were not due to direct borrowing by one from the other, but resulted from the reliance of both upon a third text. In her view, however, this older text was not Semitic, as most previous proponents of the thesis had suggested, but Egyptian. Specifically, Grumach postulated that the author of Amenemope had used an older Egyptian didactic text, which she dubbed the Alta-Lairi, as the original inspiration for his own composition, expanding and rearranging it as he went. The biblical editor of Proverbs, on the other hand, used a Canaanite translation of the Alta-Lairi, which he incorporated virtually intact as verses 22:17 and 23:10. As K.A. Kitchen noted in his review of Grumach's work, pending the discovery of a mess or fragment of such on some ostrakhan or papyrus, the very existence of the Alta-Lairi as a real entity must remain in the domain of pure hypotheses. On the other hand, Grumach provided valuable pointers to other possible sources used by Amenemope, especially the Instruction of Ptah-hotep and the Instruction of Ani, and her Roman transliteration of the Egyptian text, which she versified according to the principles of Fecht, is also quite useful.
From the 80s until today.
By the mid-70s, the strength of the von Rad wave was largely exhausted, and as a result, the 80s saw only a smattering of interest in Amenemope. Michael Fox made a few brief comments in a 1980 survey article, noting that the Ehrman consensus was still generally accepted and rejecting all proposals for Amenemope's dependence on hypothetical Semitic sources. There is nothing in Amenemope whose roots cannot be found in earlier Egyptian wisdom literature, and the Semiticisms in Amenemope are simply part of the late Egyptian language. In any case, it is pointless to speak of the influence of a body of literature entirely unknown to us, and whose existence is not suggested by the sources we do have from that general period. That same year, Antonio Loprieno published a long article on the comparative philology of Amenemope and Proverbs. Later in the decade, Theodor Hildebrandt and Paul Overland both submitted dissertations on the Book of Proverbs. The former devoted only 5 pages to Amenemope, but the latter including a long and extremely valuable excursus on the subject, which we will return to again shortly. Several other articles examined particular chapters of Amenemope, or its relationship to other literatures. Another German translation was published, and there were other brief mentions of Amenemope here and there. Perhaps the most important new contribution came at the end of the decade, a book-length essay by Dietard Romheld devoted entirely to Amenemope and its relationship with Proverbs' words of the wise in the larger context of Egyptian and Israelite wisdom literature. Romheld rejected Grumach's theory of Amenemope's dependence on an earlier Alta-Lairi and confirmed yet again the dependence of Proverbs 22:17 through 23:11 on Amenemope, possibly through the mediation of an earlier Canaanite or Hebrew translation. The relatively slow pace of Amenemope research in the 80s persisted through the 90s and has continued to the present day. Lichheim's translation has been incorporated into the first volume of Hallow's massive Context of Scripture. There have been several new articles on specific chapters and motifs, along with the usual mentions in surveys and commentaries. Wybray has provided an up-to-date summary of the issues in the literature. Foster has offered a new, if somewhat overly poetic, translation. Two of the most important contributions were Harold Washington's dissertation on the socio-economic background of Amenemope, in the course of which he provided additional evidence for a Ramesside dating, and Stuart Week's comprehensive survey of early Israelite wisdom, which carefully integrated the data of Amenemope into the context of the larger issues. But what has mostly distinguished the research on Amenemope in recent years is an extraordinary degree of skepticism, especially on the part of scholars who approach the issue from the biblical side. Despite the abject failure of the two previous attacks on the Ehrman consensus, despite the inability of any other approach, including Grumach's al-Tileri hypothesis, to win a significant following, despite the irrefutable demonstration of Amenemope's chronological priority over Proverbs and the many close parallels which have been adduced again and again, biblical scholarship, which once embraced the Ehrman consensus without reservation, has now returned to a verdict of, at best, not proved. For example, in 1994, R.N. Wybray, after noting the virtually universal consensus on the issue which had prevailed for the past 30 years, not only among Egyptologists but also among biblical scholars, reopened the question once again. Along the way, he reviewed, without a hint of criticism, the positions of Budge, Osterley, Kevin, and Drieton, all by now thoroughly discredited and even, in the case of Osterley, retracted. Then, taking his cue from Ruffles' claim that the entire case for Proverbs borrowing from Amenemope may stand or fall on Ehrman's recovery of my, M-E-N-E-S, loan, in Proverbs 22:20. Wybray attempted to discredit the Ehrman consensus by championing the Masoretic reading of the word as Silsam equals 3 days ago, or formerly, thereby yielding the line, "Did I not write to you some time ago with advice and wisdom?" Part of Wybray's argument for accepting the Masoretic reading in preference to Ehrman's is that Esgiplasm generally does not stand alone as it does in Ehrman's reconstruction. Ironically, this is even more emphatically true of the Masoretic reading Silsam, which, as Wybray himself admitted, is part of a stock expression every time it appears, except, allegedly, in Proverbs 22:20d. Wybray also rejected the commonly accepted division of the words of the wise into 30 distinct sayings, a division which would, of course, support the reading of 30 in Proverbs 22:20. Drawing on the earlier work of Nakachi, Wybray objected that one could only enumerate 30 sayings in Proverbs 22:17, 24:22 if one includes the introductions of its 3 constituent subcollections, a procedure which, he says, violates the fundamental formal principle that it is necessary to distinguish between the introductions to the individual instructions, where such exist, and the actual instruction itself, the main body of concrete teaching. Once such introductory material is excluded, he says, a count of 30 sayings becomes impossible. What he does not seem to recognize is that the same would be true of Amenemope itself, whose explicitly numbered 30 chapters include the introduction, Chapter 1, give your ears to hear what is said, give your heart to their interpretation, and the conclusion, Chapter 30, see for yourself these 30 chapters. If Wybray's fundamental formal principle precludes discerning 30 sayings in the words of the wise, it also precludes finding 30 chapters in Amenemope. Like Herzog before him, Wybray attempts to prove too much and ends up proving nothing at all. A year later, John Ruffle reprinted his 1977 article on Amenemope, which was itself a synopsis of his 1964 thesis, reiterating his earlier conclusion that any apparent borrowing by the editor of Proverbs from Amenemope was unproven at best, and at worst a result of nothing more than coincidence grounded in a common culture. Once again, Ruffle's position bears quoting. The sort of relationship that can be demonstrated can be adequately explained by the suggestion that this passage was contributed by an Egyptian scribe working at the court of Solomon, based on his memories of a text that he had heard and may be used in his scribal training. I believe this proposal fits all the requirements. A striking metaphor and the 30-chapter framework are remembered clearly, and the subject of much of the teaching is recalled, though the details and order are muddled. It seems to me that this conforms with the internal evidence of the Hebrew text and the specific note that this is part of a section based on the teaching of wise men. It conforms with our knowledge that Amenemope was used in Egyptian scribal schools, and it conforms with the known facts of the historical situation in which Proverbs was probably compiled. Shortly after Ruffles' article was reprinted, Paul Overland published an article based on his own dissertation research, in which, perhaps without realizing it, he provided a convincing refutation of Ruffles' skepticism. Specifically, he pointed out something which had escaped the notice of virtually all the other commentators on the relationship between Amenemope and the words of the wise. Throughout preceding studies, scholars have focused attention on parallel concepts and actual expressions found both in the Egyptian and Israelite texts. Their research has not paid attention to the position within the source document from which material appears to have been borrowed. Lack of attention to position in the source document is a significant omission in the present state of Proverbs/Amenemope research. Overland then proceeded to lay out the internal positioning within Amenemope of the lines which appear to have been borrowed by the editor of Proverbs. For example, Proverbs 22:24-25 reads, "Do not associate yourself with an angry man, nor go in company with a wrathful man, lest you learn his ways and catch a snare for your soul." The corresponding lines of Amenemope are, "Do not make friends with the hot-headed man, nor approach him for conversation. Do not leap to cleave to that one, lest a terror carry you away." These lines are cited by most commentators according to their column and line numbers, i.e., as XC 13-14, XI 8-9, which tells us nothing about the relative position of these lines within Amenemope's own internal chapter structure. But if we look at the actual text of Amenemope, we discover that XC 13-14 is actually the very first line of chapter 9, while XC 8-9 is the very last line of that same chapter. In effect, the editor of Proverbs has telescoped the entirety of Amenemope chapter 9 into two verses, by quoting, or more accurately paraphrasing, its opening and closing lines. In fact, of the 17 parallels cited by Overland, more than 60% are significantly positioned in this way, an astonishingly high proportion for a group of aphorisms allegedly dredged up by the ancient writer from the dim memories of schoolboy scribal exercises. As Overland pointed out, the only realistic explanation for the retention of such structural features is that the Israelite sage was aware of the way chapters in Amenemope tended to be structured, with key sentences appearing toward the beginning and end. In view of the structure evident in other parts of Proverbs, it is not surprising to find that, when he encountered a foreign document that was already structured, the Israelite sage was sensitive to that structure and made use of it as he sought to distill foreign material for the benefit of an Israelite audience. In short, the only way that the first third of the words of the wise in the book of Proverbs could have achieved its present form is if the Israelite editor had an actual text of Amenemope, or at least structured extracts therefrom, in front of him as he worked. And there the matter rests.
Conclusion.
Fortunately for the world, many a sound conclusion is reached from inadequate or even totally irrelevant premises. Otherwise, it is to be feared that for most men the chances of arriving at the truth would be infinitesimal. James G. Fraser, Folklore in the Old Testament, 1918.
Who is Amenemope?
As we saw in Chapter 3, it has often been suggested that the instruction of Amenemope, like many of the other instructions, is pseudonymous, i.e., written by someone other than its putative author. In fact, a number of commentators over the years have maintained not only that the names of Amenemope and his family might be fictitious, but also that the titles ascribed to them were more poetic than real. But as we have seen, the names come from the right time and place. Many of the titles are attested elsewhere, either verbatim or very nearly so. And above all, the concerns expressed in the instruction itself are quintessentially the concerns of a scribe living in the troubled times at the end of the 20th dynasty. So we may conclude with some confidence that Amenemope was indeed a real person, a scribe living at the end of the 20th dynasty, with numerous titles suggestive of mid-level offices in the royal bureaucracy, who resided with his wife Tawasret and their son Harmak-Haruru in the city of Ipu, and who was ultimately buried in a necropolis there, just as his instruction represents. In accord with the temper of his time, Amenemope was a genuinely devout man, who accepted without question his ancestors' belief in the high gods of Egypt, and he was particularly devoted to Thoth, the patron deity of the scribal profession, whom he both respected as the source of all knowledge and feared as the avenger of wrongdoing. He expected his son to follow in his footsteps as a respected and reasonably well-to-do holder of scribal office, and his advice to that son was not all that different from the exhortations of the Hebrew prophets who came a few centuries later. Do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. But Amenemope's advice, while addressed to his son, was not destined for him alone. Somehow it came into wide circulation, was copied and used in the schools of Egypt for centuries afterward, and part of it even found its way into the book of Proverbs in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, it is clear from the epilogue of the instruction itself that this is precisely what Amenemope had in mind. See for yourself these 30 chapters. They are pleasant, they instruct. They are the foremost of all books. They give knowledge to the ignorant. And if they are read before the ignorant one, then he is made clean by their utterance. Fill yourself with them, put them in your heart, then become a man who interprets them. It is of course possible that Amenemope simply distributed copies of his magnum opus to the scribal schools in his area, but this does not seem consistent with his own advice against self-promotion. It is much more likely that he saw the instruction as his last will and testament to his son, and therefore gave the young man a copy of it written in his father's own hand, which he was expected to learn by heart so that he could propagate it to others as an instructor in the scribal schools. It is also possible, however, that the instruction's circulation either began or was augmented in a less obvious manner, i.e., by means of a mortuary inscription. Numerous Egyptian literary works, which are now extant on papyrus or leather, actually originated as inscriptions on public or private monuments and only made the transition to more perishable material years or even centuries later at the hands of collectors who copied such inscriptions for their own or others' enjoyment. We have already mentioned the 4th dynasty prince Harjidef, who was reputed to have discovered chapters 30 and 64 of the Book of the Dead inscribed in the temples of Hermopolis, and the officials of the 18th dynasty pharaoh Amenhotep III, who scoured the ancient monuments for texts about the proper celebration of the HG. To these we may add the 19th dynasty prince Kamwaset, a son and official of Ramesses II, who made it his business to restore ancient monuments and to collect their inscriptions as he did so. But it was not just princes and royal officials who visited tombs and temples in ancient Egypt. The countless graffiti inscribed throughout Egypt by ancient travelers are eloquent testimony not only to the popularity of pilgrimage and tourism in the ancient world, but also to the literacy of at least some of those travelers. It is almost inevitable, then, that some of these literate tourists would try their hand at deciphering the old inscriptions, copying those which pleased them, and perhaps distributing them as souvenirs upon their return home. No doubt the texts which were thus copied and circulated were as diverse as the interests of those who copied them. Some had a predilection for stirring war stories and royal propaganda, so they copied the account of Ramesses II's victory at Kadesh from his inscriptions on the walls of the great temples. Ultimately, these found their way into scribal miscellanies and private libraries. One anonymous scribe from the time of Amenhotep II copied out the beginning of a temple dedication narrative which had been inscribed on a stone stela at Heliopolis 500 years earlier by Sesostris. But a surprisingly large number of these monumental texts turned literature originated in mortuary inscriptions, i.e., from the stelae or walls of cenotaphs, private mortuary chapels, or the mortuary temples of the great kings. For example, a Middle Egyptian Harper's Song, which circulated in the New Kingdom, is now extant in 2 copies, a tomb inscription from the Amarna period and a papyrus of the Ramesside era. In the latter, it is entitled A Song which is in the tomb of King Intef, the Justified, in front of the singer with the harp. Unless this ascription is simply fictitious, and there is no reason to suspect that it is, What we have here is a literary work which was originally inscribed in a Middle Kingdom royal tomb, but was copied and circulated as a literary work centuries later. Nor is this an isolated instance. Several private documents from the Ramesside era contain portions of a spell for renewing the divine offering, which must have originated in the mortuary temple of Amenhotep I. Many of the hymns to Ra, Amun, and other high gods which circulated on papyrus in the Ramesside era were originally copied from tomb inscriptions. In fact, the practice of converting mortuary texts into literary ones was so widespread that the Tale of Sinuhe, widely considered to be the masterpiece of Egyptian narrative literature, represents itself as a tomb autobiography, even though in fact it is a work of narrative fiction. The primary purpose of these tomb inscriptions, indeed the purpose of the mortuary cult as a whole, was to allow the deceased to survive death. The mortuary cult went to considerable lengths to ensure this. The body was mummified so that the deceased would have a physical form to occupy, with a statue of the deceased as backup in case the body was destroyed by malice or accident. A secure tomb was provided to house the body and its provisions for the next life, including clothes, furniture, tools, games, and even toiletries, with magical pictures and inscriptions on the tomb walls as backup in case these were stolen or destroyed. A permanent endowment was established and royal benefactions solicited so that there would always be food offerings to nourish the deceased and a caprice to perform the appropriate rituals, with pictorial and inscriptional backups for these as well. But perhaps most important of all was the need for the deceased to be remembered through the audible pronunciation of his or her name. For the Egyptian, the ultimate horror was oblivion in its most literal sense, i.e., being forgotten among the living. Hence, it was absolutely crucial that one's name be remembered and pronounced by those who came after. This was initially carried out in the funerary rituals presided over by the loving son, who was required to ensure that the name of the deceased was caused to live. It continued in the offering rituals, which accompanied the periodic festivals, which were not only celebrated at the temples but also at the tombs by the families of the departed. And ultimately, if all else failed, the pronunciation of one's name was solicited from every anonymous passerby who read the stela mounted in front of the deceased's tomb or cenotaph. For example, O living ones on earth, people living in future times, Wab priests, lector priests of Osiris Kintamentu, all those skilled in God's words, as they enter my tomb, worship in it, read my stela, recall my name, the God will favor you. You will bequeath your office to your children in old age. A son will abide in his father's seat in the favor of every town god. Ra will live for you in heaven, and Osiris in Rostau, inasmuch as you say, an offering which the king gives. The latter expression, of course, refers to the mortuary benefactions which the king donated to the cults of the gods on behalf of the dead, a fixed expression of which was inscribed on every tomb and cenotaph. So, what would an ancient tourist, with lamp and papyrus or writing tablet in hand, have encountered upon approaching a private tomb such as that of Amenemope? During the Ramesside period, there was considerable variation in tomb design from one place to another, which makes it difficult to generalize. Moreover, we have little direct evidence at all from Akhmim itself, where Amenemope had planned to be buried, since the cemeteries there have been looted but never systematically excavated. Nevertheless, we may reasonably surmise that their layout was not too different from that of a similar facility in Thebes of the same period, and these have been extensively described. A typical Ramesside mortuary chapel began with frontal pylons, similar to those of a New Kingdom cult temple, which opened onto a walled, rectangular courtyard. Depending on the wealth and preference of the owner, this might be surrounded by decorative columns, planted with trees, or excavated to create a large bathing pool. On the other side of the courtyard, set against the wall of the necropolis cliff, was a porch surmounted by a protective roof. In the center of the porch was a doorway leading into the chapel, which had been carved out of the living rock. To the left of the doorway was a large mortuary stela, displaying a picture of the deceased, his titles, a request for prayers on his behalf, and a warning against anyone who might seek to desecrate his tomb. Surmounting the entire structure was a steep-sided pyramid, with a niche in the front containing a kneeling statue of the deceased. Inside the doorway, in the cool of the interior, was a broad hall, set at right angles to the entryway, corresponding to the reception room of a private house. At one end of the broad hall lay a false door by which the deceased was believed to enter and leave the tomb. At the other end was a second and perhaps much larger stela containing the biography of the deceased. The remaining walls were covered with scenes from daily life. In the middle of the broad hall's long wall, directly opposite the main entryway, was a second doorway, which admitted the visitor to a narrow corridor leading deep into the rock of the cliff face. At the end of this corridor lay a small room with a niche containing the statue of the deceased. Its walls were covered with funeral scenes, representations of the gods, and lists of offerings. It was here that the offering rituals were performed for the occupant of the tomb, whose mummy, preserved for eternity, lay at the bottom of a shaft driven deep into the rock below the floor of the chapel. The problem with these elaborate and expensive preparations, especially toward the end of the Ramesside period, was that they were almost certain to fail. Perhaps Amenemope himself sensed that it would inevitably be so, given the time in which he lived and the widespread economic and political troubles which had turned grave robbing into an almost universal vice. He may well have realized that whatever he provided for himself in the way of a house of eternity could not remain undisturbed for very long. Inevitably, his tomb would be robbed, his mummified body ravaged, and his name forgotten. But the sages had shown him the way. If you want to be remembered after you are gone, trust not in tombs and rituals, but in the instructions. As for those learned scribes from the time that came after gods, those who predicted what was to come, they have become men whose names endure forever. The instructions are their tombs, the reed pen their child, the stone surface a wife. Their portals and mansions have crumbled. Their servants are gone. Their tombstones are covered with soil. Their graves are forgotten, but their names are pronounced over their books, which they made while they had being. Good is the memory of their makers. It is forever and eternity. We may thus imagine the scribe Amenemope ordering that a large stela be prepared for his tomb with the words of his instruction inscribed upon it. Like any mortuary text, it would include the names and titles of the deceased, his wife and his son, as well as an exhortation to read the inscribed text. Just as we find in the opening lines of Amenemope, such a stela might have been placed to the left of the door of the mortuary chapel, where it could be read by anyone standing on the outer porch. But more likely it would have been placed inside the chapel itself, for it was here that Amenemope's loving son, i.e. the one who was assigned the responsibility for keeping up his father's mortuary cult, would have had to proceed on festival days to make the required offerings. The cool privacy of the mortuary chapel would have been the perfect location for Amenemope to place an instruction which he hoped his son would read again and again. One can almost see the young man perusing his father's admonitions in the flickering lamplight as the priest muttered incantations before the offering table on festival days. Thus, even if the original of the instruction were misplaced or destroyed, as we know did happen from time to time, there would always be a convenient backup copy available in Amenemope's tomb. And even if Harmaharu himself were to lose interest in his father's legacy, or fall from grace with Pharaoh, or be kidnapped by marauding Nubians and never seen again, the inscription on imperishable stone would still be there, waiting for some wandering collector of antiquarian lore to discover the tomb, copy out the wisdom he found there, and begin again the pronunciation of the names which it contained. In any case, someone made a copy, and then copies were made from the copies, until Amenemope's text was known throughout Egypt. Eventually, it became a staple of the scribal schools, and finally it found its way to the land of Israel.
Where and when?
A great deal of ink has been spilled over the question of when, where, and how the Israelites could have come into contact with Egyptian literature, such as Amenemope. As Osterley pointed out in his ill-fated effort to make Amenemope dependent on a Semitic original, there were only a few windows of opportunity for that sort of contact, and all of them came after the establishment of the Israelite monarchy. Before then, the disparate Hebrew tribes would have been too scattered, too close to bare subsistence, and too preoccupied with day-to-day survival to have much use even for a written literature of their own, much less anyone else's. With the coming of the monarchy, however, including the extension of literacy and the centralization of resources required for a state administrative apparatus, Both the development of an internal literary culture and contacts with foreign literatures become more plausible. In the von Rad generation of wisdom research, the biblical picture of a Solomonic enlightenment was widely accepted as basically accurate, if perhaps somewhat exaggerated around the edges. Today, that consensus has almost totally collapsed. A few brave souls continue to champion the essential accuracy of the biblical picture, but today one is more likely to hear that David and Solomon were just local chieftains who ruled over no more than a few thousand impoverished peasants. Or perhaps that they were merely figments of post-exilic scribal imagination, with no more reality than Peter Pan. In any case, until we have more archaeological data on 10th century Jerusalem and better attestation of the nature and extent of the Israelite monarchy in its early centuries, it would be imprudent to attempt to situate any contacts in that era. Subsequent centuries are better attested on the Israelite side, but are plagued on the Egyptian side with a fragmentation state authority and a consequent inability of Egypt to project significant military power outside its own borders. It was not until the rise of the 25th dynasty in the middle of the 8th century that Egypt once again became a major player in Near Eastern politics. Shortly thereafter, we arrive at the period in Israelite history when an Egyptian connection is not only the most plausible, but also the most demonstrable: the reign of Hezekiah. Hezekiah's father Ahaz had been a loyal vassal of the Assyrian king. He paid extensive tribute, removed the symbols of his own royal status from the temple precincts so as not to offend his overlord, and even installed a new altar of foreign design in front of the Jerusalem temple. When Hezekiah came to the throne, however, he reversed his father's policies in toto. He purified the temple, re-established the temple offerings which his father had suppressed or allowed to fall into abeyance, cleansed Jerusalem of its consecrated pillars and Asherah poles, and even destroyed the bronze serpent whose manufacture was attributed to Moses himself. Next, he invited the people of Samaria to come to Jerusalem for the celebration of the Passover, which many of them did. Immediately thereafter, the high places, i.e. the traditional Israelite worship centers outside Jerusalem, were destroyed, not only in Judah but deep into Samaria as well, thereby concentrating the worship of Yahweh in Jerusalem alone. On the political side, Hezekiah presided over an expansion and fortification of the city of Jerusalem, whose population increased dramatically during this period, possibly due to the arrival of refugees fleeing from Assyrian oppression in the north. The city's walls were repaired, its water supply was protected, additional storage facilities were constructed, and the army was given new officers and equipped with new weapons. Inevitably, Hezekiah's behavior drew the attention of his Assyrian masters, who drew the appropriate conclusions. As the biblical record bluntly states, Hezekiah rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. Not surprisingly, the Assyrians responded by sending an army against Judah, seizing most of its territory, shutting up Hezekiah in his capital like a bird in a cage, and forcing him to pay a massive tribute. Much of the biblical account of these years is taken up with arguments over Hezekiah's reliance on Egypt as the key to throwing off Assyrian domination. As we saw in chapter 1, the prophets bitterly criticized the tendency of the court's Egyptian party to look to Egypt's men and horses, their deliverance, instead of relying on Yahweh. The same criticisms, interestingly enough, were made by the Assyrian king himself, who warned Hezekiah, "On whom are you depending that you rebel against me? On Egypt, that splintered reed of a staff, which pierces a man's hand and wounds him if he leans on it. Such is Pharaoh king of Egypt to all who depend on him." And indeed, in the event the Egyptians failed to make good on their promises, and only a miracle, which was even recorded by Herodotus, albeit in somewhat different terms than those of the biblical account, saved Jerusalem itself from capture by the Assyrian army. For our purposes, the most important point is that it was probably during this period that Egyptian influence at the Judean court reached its zenith. This is evidenced not only by the biblical record, but also by the record of archaeology. In recent years, a great many clay ceilings from the period of Hezekiah have been unearthed, and they tell a striking tale. Hezekiah, remember, was a righteous king who trusted in the Lord and held fast to the Lord and did not cease to follow him, who kept the commands which the Lord had given to Moses, so that there was no one like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. And yet, on the official seals of Hezekiah, we find imagery that is undeniably Egyptian. On one, a winged sun disk flanked by Ankh signs. On others, a scarab beetle pushing the solar disk through the sky. While some have tried to dismiss these as merely demythologized motifs of royal power and beneficence, the use of such explicitly Egyptian symbolism during the explicitly Egyptophile reign of King Hezekiah suggests that it was more than this, that in fact, Hezekiah was engaged in a conscious program of Egyptianizing the kingdom of Judah in order to make it a more attractive partner for Egypt in their common resistance to Assyrian hegemony. If so, what would be more natural than for his scribes to acquaint themselves with the classics of Egyptian literature, and among these, of course, would be the Instruction of Amenemope. This possibility is rendered even more plausible by the fact that shortly after the words of the wise in Proverbs 22:17-24, which clearly betray the influence of Amenemope, we arrive at Proverbs, which begins, "These also are Proverbs of Solomon, which were copied by the men of Hezekiah." So the book of Proverbs itself testifies that it was augmented during the reign of Hezekiah. What better time for the Proverbs of Amenemope to have been incorporated into it?
Chaos or coma?
Over the past 3/4 of a century, the Instruction of Amenemope has been subjected to an unusual amount of examination. In turn, it has spawned an extraordinary amount of heated controversy, which occasionally boils over even in our own day. In retrospect, it is not hard to see why. First, Amenemope entered the public arena at a time when the grammar and vocabulary of late Egyptian were still a mystery even to many professional Egyptologists. The scope of the available literature was considerably more narrow than it is today, and the historical significance of the age of personal piety was only dimly understood by most. Hence, Amenemope seemed more of an oddity than a treasure, completely out of place in ancient Egypt as it was then understood, and more akin to the spirit of Israelite monotheism, at least as that was then understood. Many of the early analyses of Amenemope, and even some which weren't so early, labored under misconceptions about Egyptian language, literature, and religion, which the steady advance of Egyptological knowledge has subsequently rendered untenable. Those misconceptions inevitably led to controversies which generated a great deal of heat, but very little light. Second, Amenemope represented a tangible challenge to the widely held assumption that the Judeo-Christian tradition was not only inherently superior to all others, but sui generis as well. To minds which naturally divided the world into two camps, with Jews and Christians on one side and godless heathen on the other, Amenemope, as he is portrayed in his instruction, simply didn't fit the available categories. Living as he did in a time when personal piety was very much on the agenda of the cultured Egyptian, he quite naturally incorporated into his instruction the central concerns of that piety: moral rectitude, solicitude for the poor and downtrodden, generosity toward one's enemies, tranquility of spirit, and submission to the inscrutability of divine will. Such principles were generally associated in the Western mind almost exclusively with the Hebrew prophets and the Sermon on the Mount, not with godless pagans. But Amenemope demonstrably was a pagan. His instruction was littered with references to the Egyptian gods. His son was a priest of the particularly offensive fertility deity Min, bull of his mother, and Amenemope's own piety was focused on the god Thoth, patron of scribes, whom he identified with the moon and fondly referred to as the ibis and the baboon. In short, Amenemope unsettled the old certainties by suggesting that the simplistic categories of earlier times would have to be reconsidered, or perhaps even abandoned, unless some way could be found to hammer it into one of those categories. But as we have seen, no such efforts even came close to success. Neither the early bids to discover in Amenemope some sort of philosophical monotheist, nor the repeated attempts to demonstrate his dependence on a Semitic precursor. Amenemope stubbornly resisted all efforts to turn him into anything other than what he actually was, an ancient Egyptian polytheist who was devoted to his personal god, tried to live as he thought the gods required, and urged others to do the same. Third, Amenemope had and still has important ramifications for biblical scholarship, and potentially disturbing theological implications for those sectors of the Jewish and Christian religious communities which are committed to the more literal theories of biblical inspiration. For a long time before Budge's publication of Amenemope, scholars had been arguing about the biblical author's possible use of earlier sources, some of which are even attested in the biblical text itself. But never before had they actually possessed an independently transmitted copy of a significant text which had ultimately ended up in the body of Scripture, albeit in a much reduced and heavily edited form. If it were true that the editor of Proverbs had borrowed from Amenemope, then the use of external sources, and non-Israelite sources at that, could finally be moved from the realm of speculation to that of established fact. And if, as seemed to be the case, the comparison of Amenemope with Proverbs demonstrated the correctness of earlier emendations by biblical scholars, then the legitimacy of such emendations could also be considered as proven. To some, such results were exciting, to others, unpleasant but at least tolerable. To many, however, and especially to those in the more conservative religious traditions, such results struck at the heart of long-standing beliefs, and therefore were greeted with skepticism and even hostility. Ironically, as we have moved from the era of Budge and Lanx to the era of Foucault and Derrida, the hostility toward the Ehrman consensus is perhaps as strong as ever, but now that hostility is coming from the other end of the ideological spectrum. In times past, the notion that the Bible borrowed from pagan Egypt was an implicit challenge to theological orthodoxy. Now the complaint seems to be that one cannot know for sure that any such thing really did happen, and even if it did, why should we care? The "we can't really know anything" position has been aptly characterized by Baruch Halpern as negative fundamentalism. An author's convictions were by definition biases, and by definition, any evidence the author adduced was baseless. From this premise emerged a working sketch of the Israelite historian, a man unconstrained by the credence of contemporaries, without loyalty to fact or common knowledge, a writer rather than a historian, an editor, not a scholar. He perpetrated the wildest enormities on unsuspecting readers. Here throbs the arterial pulse of negative fundamentalism. Scribes lie, historians invent, and the Hebrew Bible is a not-so-pious fraud. The "why should we care" position was an inevitable result of the negative fundamentalism. If we can't really know anything, then even what we think we know is up for grabs, and no better than what anyone else may think they know. The resulting chaos was well described by G.T. Shepard in a recent article entitled "Biblical Wisdom Literature at the End of the Modern Age." Shepard declared, "I concede to postmodern critics who claim any text, including a biblical text, can be read legitimately in perhaps an infinite number of ways. No text can speak for itself enough to stop us from doing anything we want to do with it. So, I celebrate the recent proliferation of new methodologies and ideologies, even though I will not always know which will prove the more enduring and useful over time. If texts, according to postmodern theory, prove susceptible to nearly an infinite number of equally valid hermeneutical strategies, then the old modern axiom that we read the Bible like any other book only leaves us with a postmodern pluralism of possibilities, each anchored in the subjectivity, autonomy, and autocracy of the individual reader." While Shepard implied that he does not necessarily endorse the most extreme versions of this sort of subjectivity, his description of the current state of affairs seems quite accurate and quite likely explains why wisdom study, including the study of Amenemope, seems once again to have lapsed into the kind of academic coma from which Wallace Budge rescued it almost 80 years ago.
What have we learned?
For those of us who do still think it is possible to know things with reasonable certainty, it is time to review the results of our investigation. The Instruction of Amenemope is a product of the Ramesside era, in all likelihood composed sometime between 1240 and 1070 BC. Its author was the scribe Amenemope, son of Connacht. His hometown was Tejani in the nome of Tawer, whose most famous city was Abydos. He was the husband of the temple musician Tawosret, who was probably also originally from Tejani. He was the father or perhaps the stepfather of Harmakeru, who became a priest of Min at Ipu/Akhmim. Amenemope himself was a scribe in the civil service at Ipu, with responsibilities for the regulation of arable land in the region and the disposition of the grain taxes received from that land, including the provision of foodstuffs for the daily temple offerings. Amenemope's instruction is a typical product of the age of personal piety, fully at home in the Egypt of his day, both theologically and linguistically. While Amenemope was certainly familiar with and influenced by other Egyptian didactic literature, as well as the literature of scribal devotion to the god Thoth, there is no justification whatever for thinking that he was influenced by or borrowed from any sources outside Egypt itself. On the other hand, the evidence is overwhelming that Amenemope's instruction had a significant formative influence on the composition of the words of the wise in the biblical book of Proverbs 22:17 and 24:22, as can be seen by a perusal of the parallels listed in Appendix 2. This influence operates at several levels, including 1. Near vertigation of entire lines or groups of lines insofar as such can be accomplished in translation. 2. Reproducing the ideas of a line or group of lines by paraphrasing rather than copying. 3. Borrowing individual phrases, motifs, and word clusters but placing them in a new context. 4. Adopting the general themes of a line or group of lines, which are then recast into a more Hebraic mold. And 5. Telescoping a thought unit or an entire chapter by excerpting the opening and closing lines of the unit and deleting everything in between. This last procedure precludes the hypothesis that Amenemope's influence on Proverbs was nothing more than a scribe's recollection of a few snippets from the scribal exercises of his youth, or that the editor of Proverbs only had access to a table of contents consisting of only the initial line of each chapter of Amenemope. At a minimum, he was working from an executive summary consisting of brief synopses or excerpts of the individual chapters. More likely, he had either the complete hieratic text of Amenemope before him, or a Semitic translation thereof. Hermann's emendation in Proverbs 22:20 of Silsum equals formerly to SGP Blosim equals 30 was undoubtedly correct, despite all subsequent claims to the contrary. It is also quite likely that it was the presence of this reference to 30 sayings which governed the large-scale structure of the entire words of the wise, even if subsequent damage to the text in the course of transmission has made it difficult to enumerate precisely 30 sayings to everyone's satisfaction. The fact that portions of Proverbs were borrowed from an Egyptian didactic text of the Ramesside era proves two important points which have long been in contention. 1. The biblical authors and editors did have access to documents whose origins go back even beyond the founding of the Israelite monarchy. 2. They did not hesitate to use such documents, albeit with extensive editing to adapt them to their new context, as direct sources for the biblical text, even when the documents came from the hands of pagans. But the most important conclusion of all is also the broadest. If Amenemope teaches us anything, it is that what the West has traditionally been accustomed to think of as Judeo-Christian morality, in fact, preceded both Jews and Christians by more than a millennium, and that our hybrid Judeo-Christian/Greco-Roman heritage is ultimately the heritage of Egypt. As James Henry Breasted put it in the final chapter of his monumental work, The Dawn of Conscience, in law and mythology, the Hebrews drew much from Babylonian civilization, but in morals, in religion, and in social thinking in general, the Hebrews built up their life on Egyptian foundations. The fundamental conclusions that form the basis of moral convictions, and continue to do so in civilized life at the present day, had already been reached in Egyptian life long before the Hebrews began their social experience in Palestine, and those Egyptian moral convictions had been available in written form in Palestine for centuries when the Hebrews settled there. The sources of our inheritance of moral tradition are therefore far from having been confined to Palestine, but must be regarded as including also Egyptian civilization. With this assessment, Amenemope himself would no doubt be pleased, and, having completed our survey of the evidence and drawn our conclusions, we may now add our assent to his. Section 2. The Prologue of Amenemope. Here the scholar aims at what is called a literal translation, transforming the hieroglyphs into English more or less on a word-for-word basis. This literal translation is the most important single stage of the progress from broken stone to final poem. Unfortunately, at this stage there is also no poem. The literal translation has not and should not pretend to have any literary value. John L. Foster, Echoes of Egyptian Voices, 1992. Introductory Notes. On the format of Section 2, every translation ought to be accompanied by a mass of critical notes which are not only very costly to print, but which repel the average reader, and thus actually detract from the historical value of the publication. T.E. Peat, A Historical Document of Ramesside Age, 1924. Thank you for listening. See you in the next one.